So let's begin maybe with an obvious starting point, how you ended up becoming a rabbi.
Hmm. So the answer to that question is also the answer to why am I sitting where I am right now. Um, I was raised in a marginally connected, engaged Jewish family with a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish stepfather. We went to synagogue regularly, but there was never any conversation about spirituality, the divine, the soul, our divine obligations, what our rituals mean in a larger way. And so when I eventually made my way to a free trip to Israel when I was 15, without like any real still connection to the tradition, it just sounded like a fun thing to do. I had an unrehearsed, unscheduled, totally just from out of nowhere, an endogenous mystical experience that kind of, it was very clear, right, that this was the divine reaching out to me. It was momentary. It was overwhelming. When people talk about the classic mystical experiences of intuitive knowledge, it was obvious that what this meant was it's time to be a religious person and it's time to continue to seek out wisdom in practice. So I was 15 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no teacher. I was in suburban North Carolina, not like a hub of deeply engaged, although wonderful community, but not a religious fervor and excitement like the kind that I was experiencing. And so from that point on, continued to seek out my own Jewish education at that point on an intense level, teaching myself, going to yeshiva, eventually like studying intensely on my own for many years, getting a master's at UC Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union in biblical languages, and eventually knowing that I wanted to be a rabbi. I wanted to be a master of this tradition and to also just to be a teacher. It was so clear to me that not only did I need to hurry up and feed myself, but to feed others. And that's what my job as a rabbi has been, is to find the most meaningful, most exciting parts of our tradition that are little known to most people that I'm around, and to finding the ways to share it with them, express my own excitement around it, and to get them engaged in the ways that are authentic to them.
Right. And it sounds, I'm interested in this mystical experience you had, because as you probably know, the reason I'm sitting here is because I had a spontaneous mystical experience as a teenager as well. And you used the phrase, you said the divine, it felt like the divine was reaching out to you, and there may be a subtle difference in our experiences that might be worth exploring, or, because I think in religious experience, there are these kind of mystical experiences of unitive states, right, with everything, where your sense of self can fall away, but also at the other extreme, maybe would be visionary states where there's a feeling of a presence or of an entity or like a God or something you're in relation to. Mine was very much, it didn't feel like there was an intelligent, well, it's hard to use words for this stuff. It felt like all of reality is intelligent, but I didn't feel like I wouldn't say the divine was reaching out to me in my experience. But in yours, is there a subtle difference there in the way that I just outlined?
Yeah, I'd love to know more about yours as well. I think you're expressing more on the unitive end of the spectrum, where the self falling away. For me, it was classic relational, right? There was a presence, a will, a volition, right? And in some ways a demand that was something that I couldn't deny, and couldn't shake. I couldn't shake it for many years. And so in that way, I've come to learn that maybe this is actually more of a classical Jewish mystical experience. We talk about perennialism, and we talk about the top of the mountain where all of these traditions actually seem to converge in some way. But I still want to leave the room for diversity and difference, in that, because there is such a range of experiences, even within the Jewish mystical tradition, that the relational one seems to still be at the center, even while we have things like unitive experiences, the dissolution of ego and self. Those all kind of are around what is probably what I would call covenantal.
Right. So, I mean, I guess also for me, when I was kind of doing a lot of therapeutic work on myself in my kind of late 20s using psychedelics, that involved huge kind of, emotional, religious experiences that people have in those states. And I found that actually during that period and for quite a while after, I started having kind of what you might call these kinds of relational experiences, especially walking in nature, seeing kind of beautiful sunsets. For the first time, I felt this, it's not something I've really spoken about before, but it almost like there was something that was kind of, it was quite scary because it felt like if I went down this route, it was like meaning was coming to me from, this other place. And it really felt to me like, having been raised Catholic, even though we'll get into, I think at some point, the fact I have kind of Jewish ancestry as well. But having been raised Catholic, it really felt to me like, oh, okay, this is the kind of experience that makes people kind of turn into evangelical Christians or just whatever the religion is that their context is. Because it's like, oh, okay, like forget everything I've ever learned through science, forget everything, all these games of understanding the world. This feels undeniable and it feels very much like it's kind of written in the Bible. There's just this message coming to you. And I felt quite intimidated by it and found that it went away after a while. Like as I kind of went from spending a lot of time in these very out there states of consciousness to do this healing work, once I just kind of had my feet on the ground more and returned to more mundane or, everyday consciousness, it stopped happening. And I didn't intentionally turn towards it again. But it's interesting to me that I feel like I'm glad I went through that because I now feel like I have some sense of what it maybe was like, this kind of relational, this relational attitude. And I think it's interesting the way that it can conflict with narratives we have about the world. If trained as a scientist, it's hard to suddenly, a lot of what I do is talk about mysticism, the unitive stuff, how it makes sense with science, but the relational stuff is harder for me to square with a kind of strictly scientific worldview. So I wonder if did having it happen at such a young age, do you feel that set you up to accept it maybe in the way that I struggled, maybe you didn't?
Yeah, I think yes, I did. I never questioned what happened in terms of its content or was it just kind of a projection or how culturally conditioned it was, all of the questions that might come later, because it was the most overwhelming experience that I had ever had. That it was easier for me to accept than to turn to a skeptical eye. And even today, I have like some mind of a skeptic, but I'm also just kind of a lover of things. I don't try to pull things apart and actually get to the truth content. There are things that I want to hold close, right? It seems right, it tastes right, looks right. And that way my religious life is much closer to what I would say art than science. There are things that strike me that I appreciate that I can't name and quantify. Like I'll tell you why the Rothko, right? The blue goes this way and the orange goes this way and it hits the eye this way. That's very interesting to me. But to stand before that kind of creation and to be in its presence is something that fills me in a way that it doesn't when I'm using an analytical lens.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important to emphasize the primacy of experience in terms of how we live our lives. Like meaning or beauty, all these things exist and are real, and then the analytical coming up with maps of the world, playing the science game. It's a very thin kind of, it feels quite thin and empty by comparison to the actual kind of lived experience of life. And yeah, in the same way with the Rothko, you can have the experience of the art. And then if you are so inclined, you might learn about complementary colors, and you might learn about the kind of the mappings of how he pulls off something and has that effect. And that can give you maybe a little bit of more, a different kind of experience of engaging with it. And I think that's how I view science, is just as, you know, you've got this beautiful thing of existence, and then we're trying to just be like, well, how does it all fit together? And so, yeah, when it comes to the relational stuff, I think I can't easily slot it into the existing kind of scientific worldview, in part because it's just been utterly neglected philosophically and scientifically. I think in like modern secular science, it's just not something, visionary states are not something that is really kind of studied and taken seriously. But so I do hold the door open to a revising of my conception of reality, I think, that would put this stuff as being primary. But I'm also interested in, exactly as you said, how much can we explain through psychological dynamics and things. But it's weird for me to be in this position as someone who's had the unitive mystical experience in a way where, you know, as you know, it has this noetic quality of, you know, the insight you've gleaned is real, and it's because it's just so powerful and obvious. And so a skeptic would say to me, well, look, how do you really know? And they just wouldn't get it, you know. And I feel like in some sense with the relational stuff, I'm having it both ways, a bit hypocritically, of saying my mystical experience that I had, I really believe in the validity of it, and then certain other kinds of ones I'm more skeptical. But I guess that's also why I marry it with the science, to try to be like, well, I think I'm certain about it, but let's see what makes sense. Let's see how it all adds up, just in case. I guess there's always a bit of skepticism.